Okay, so welcome to part two of Introduction to Risk and Disruption in Supply Chain Management for week one. Um, we talked about some of the different aspects related to location and of risk associated with supply chains, and define supply chain disruptions, and provided an example in the earlier part of this lecture. But let's also talk about some of the trends that have caused supply chain risk to increase and disruptions to be more manifest. Number one, some of it is self-inflicted. Basically, different companies and businesses have opted to strive to improve their financial performance in many ways by probably cutting back on some of the buffers that is throughout the supply chain. The implementations and the practices done were generally intended to increase revenue and reduce cost, and we have been very successful at that. Examples are supply-based reduction, which is basically working with a lower number of suppliers in general. Of course, sourcing, be it online or otherwise, to outside of the organization. So we have electronic markets and online auctions on the internet and technology side, but also offshore manufacturing, which has caused us to be more distant from the sources of supply. Another aspect is simply just-in-time inventory system. Just-in-time is not just about inventory. Nevertheless, it does entail reducing waste, and at times, without really understanding the benefit and the purpose of inventory, it could be reduced. And so that can, as much as we dislike fat, the fact of the matter is that fat is a wonderful thing when there is dire needs for some kind of nutrition across the supply chain as well. So an inventory plays that buffer and role when necessary. Same goes with VMI, or vendor managed inventory. When we have the onus on the supplier to provide the inventory and to manage that inventory, at times the supplier is also forced to reduce inventory, or perhaps to allocate it in a location that may not be as much of a priority to the downstream customers' needs. And we've also reduced assets. Again, with outsourced manufacturing, the technology and the tools are not necessarily downstream in the supply chain, and the logistics, as we become faster and quicker, sometimes we are unable to respond to changes as quickly as we want. One of the elements that we're going to talk about, you're going to hear this again throughout the course, is about the added complexity. Complexity and complex products and complex supply chains add to the possibility of risk and disruption to show themselves. Stable environments are wonderful because we can see what's going on. As the complexity increases, it also lends itself to a more change and dynamism. But as a particular to complex supply chains, as the number of partners increase, the length increases, and also the interaction between the players increase, so that we have a difficult time truly understanding the possibility of failures. It's a very simple example of that would be a recipe for a simple Mexican food, and a more complicated one. As we add more herbs, spices, and sauces, guacamole, sour cream, etc., it's very much more difficult to recognize what type of herb, spices, and ingredients interact with each other to make it distasteful to the customer, right? So complexity, be it in food or be it in supply chain, adds to the possibility of negative results. Of course, the benefits of complexity are that if we can figure out how to make it work, we have something very unique, right? And so good restaurants, good Mexican restaurants, do have their own secret recipe and secret sauce, but it's tried and true rather than just being more complicated with adding stuff in. So long and complex supply chains, especially on the global side, can be slower to change in response unless we introduce agility into the system, and can be more vulnerable to business disruption. Why so vulnerable? And this might be a little bit redundant in terms of the earlier slide, but it's important to mention. There is adoption of lean practices, and that has reduced the amount of inventory. I should also mention that at times there are positive effects associated with lean. Lean provides us with a semblance of organization. It simplifies the complex. It allows us for better scheduling. It allows us for better uptime. And all of those things can help with managing disruptions and risks. So oftentimes the critique of lean that happens is because folks consider lean to be just about inventory, and that's not the case at all. In the interest of focus in this class, we're not going to go into that, but for those of you who hear about lean practices being the cause of disruptions, I would caution to read through a bit more about how lean practices can actually be a benefit in the face of disruptions beyond the just-in-time and inventory aspects. Of course, the move to offshore manufacturing and the length, outsourcing, and the reduction of supply base, the global consolidation. The centralized production and distribution is another aspect that the other DECA slides did not have, and this, let me take the English version of this out and make it American. Centralization of production and distribution is wonderful from the standpoint that we can figure out where the inventory is. It's not so good because now all of our inventory is located in one central spot, right? And it becomes much more difficult to get it to all the corners and the peripheries of a network. So let's take an example, or perhaps another perspective on this related to supply chain risk, and on what some other folks familiar with this arena discuss in terms of what has happened in the past few years and perhaps how to better mitigate it. So let's take a listen to this representative from Protiviti.
One of the key risks that we're still seeing in the manufacturing sector is around supply chain disruption. If we look at what manufacturing companies have focused on over the last several years, it's how can they be lean and low cost in their supply chains, whether it's single sourcing, strategic sourcing, offshoring, any myriad of things that have frankly left a very low inventory buffer, so that when you do have a disruption to that supply chain, it ends up having a very immediate effect. We see three things that companies really should be focused on moving forward. The first is that they should take a very wide view, a broad view of what their supply chain is, and identify all of the relevant risks to that supply chain. That would include looking way upstream, so not just to your immediate suppliers. We found that more than 40% of the supply chain disruptions last year were not with your direct supplier. It was a supplier upstream. So really taking a look at the full end-to-end value chain. They should also look at concentrations. If you decide not to single source and you have a backup supplier, if they're in the same geographic region, that could still create a problem. So we think that step number one for companies is to take a very broad view of the supply chain and identify all the relevant risks. Second thing is around prioritizing. And it's very common to prioritize around significance and likelihood. So what's the impact to the business of that particular disruption? And what's the likelihood? The challenge with that is that it tends to de-emphasize the black swans, those that are high impact and low likelihood. So we recommend that companies consider three additional factors. One being velocity. So how quickly will this particular supply chain disruption impact the business? Second is around persistence, which is how long will this have an impact on the company should it persist? And then third is around response readiness. So how flexible is the company? How proactive are they about being able to respond once something occurs? And I think that will give a much different perspective when prioritizing what risk management strategies they should put in place. And that third step is around then developing risk management strategies for those relevant risks. And that could be around not single sourcing and maybe developing relationships with suppliers up the stream just to have an alternate source. It could be making a decision about maybe carrying a higher inventory level at a higher cost, but to have a little bit more of a buffer so that if there is a short-term disruption, you can weather through that. And looking at the concentration of where your suppliers are in order to mitigate those risks. It's not so much who's got the leanest supply chain. It's really who has the most robust and proactive supply chain that will be the competitive winner in the end.
Interesting insights, right? You notice what you mentioned in terms of risk management. We're going to talk a lot about risk management and in terms of risk analysis in the coming weeks. And but I like her consideration about velocity, persistence of the disruptions, and also how ready the organization is. So let's take a look at some of the disruptions that have occurred. This information actually comes from Zurich, the insurance company. And in terms of priorities or significance, you can see how their report talks about adverse weather, windstorm, tornado, flooding, or what they call NatCat, carries 51% of the cases, followed by unplanned outage in terms of IT, and then on to transportation and network disruption. However, my thought that their survey was actually done with a heavy emphasis on the financial rather than the manufacturing. I've done similar surveys with the automotive industry, and the risks of actual goods disruptions were much higher. Nevertheless, this kind of gives you a sense of both man-made and also natural categories of disruptions are of a concern. Probably more importantly is the next slide is in terms of property damage versus business interruption. Property damage, of course, is when we have buildings and whatever else that are damaged equipment. Business interruption is when we don't have a source of income. And you can see how business interruption has gained significantly more share from 2005 to 2012 in this result. So the reason why Zurich is interested in reporting these, of course, is they're looking into offering business interruption insurance. Nevertheless, instead of insurance, which essentially is a pooling of risk for companies, a better approach is to try and minimize it through ways that they can do so internally. In a few slides or in a few minutes, we're going to look into some proactive and some reactive strategies that can help with limiting or eliminating business interruption losses. What have we learned so far? Supply chain risk is systemic. And the biggest risk to business continuity could be outside the company. In fact, it is these days, because we already have a pretty good understanding of our internals and the complexity and interconnectedness of the supply chain increases their vulnerability. Let's take a look at managing this notion of supply base risks. As we heard from the lady from Fortivity, one of the key things that needs to happen is identifying what the common risks are, how can they be managed effectively, and perhaps even more importantly is the velocity, the impact of these risks, right? So they must be evaluated relative to the cost exposure and the probability of occurrence. So the cost, that's item 1, and 2 is the probability of occurrence. The issue here is that this is easier said than done, and we're going to hear from experts throughout the course and as part of your case study analysis, and you're going to recognize that as much as the instructions on this are very simple, gathering the information to do so is not that easy. Furthermore, risk is inherent in all sourcing decisions. When we source, we rely on somebody else to provide the service or the product, and so there's an inherent possibility that something is going to go wrong, and our burgers or tacos or whatever else may not be made the way we want them, let alone our chips for cell phones or our tires for cars. And the other thing we're going to talk about in this class is the differentiating between risk and uncertainty. Hold on to that thought as we come back to it, but uncertainty and risk are not necessarily the same. Nevertheless, risk can mean that we're going to have expenditures of time, effort, and money to fix things and put them back to normal. At times, and oftentimes, if the media gets a hold of it, a company at risk doesn't even have to have a disruption to have a negative public relations. And that can result in a loss of customer confidence, and of course, as a result, could have a lost sales. There are other impacts of risk that you're going to see as we go forward. But let's talk about the categories of risk. This is another way of looking at supply-based risk than the previous categorization that we had. Instead of looking at it from a value-based standpoint, this is more of a conceptual and topic or area-based. There are political risks, there are market risks, there are sourcing risks, financial risk, and supply risk. We're going to talk about how sourcing risk and supply risk can be different depending on the strategy that the organization takes. So, political risk can be because of country stability. If we're sourcing from Egypt and there's the Arab Spring, then that becomes a stability issue. Regional stability, same example probably applies. Eastern Europe, perhaps Ukraine is another example of what's going on. Political party and government stability is another element. The Keystone Pipeline is a perfect example. It wasn't going through the Congress. It wasn't going through the Congress with the Democrats in charge, but now it is going through the Congress with the Republicans. Nevertheless, there is instability as to how the president is going to react to having shale oil piped from Canada all the way down to Texas. At times there are legal differences. Many times it has occurred that folks that have been operating in Russia, big names in Russia, have had to change their business approach because of the legal ramifications and the legal matters to that particular country. And we probably have all heard about IP rights and issues of copying and lawsuits with Far East companies. It seems like every time we turn around, Samsung and Apple, Motorola and LG or whoever else are battling over some type of an IP right. Elections, we talked about military actions. You know, the minute there is an expectation of invasion or military involvement, be it in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, whatever else, we see a reflection on the markets, particularly related to what the country might be considered to be quite good at. Civil disturbances also affected. We just heard about Hong Kong and the disturbances associated with human rights with the central Chinese government in charge was another example. We all know about terrorism, especially here in New Jersey and New York, and the most unfortunate of all, and probably harder to predict. Nevertheless, I think we're doing much better in terms of assessing issues. All right, so let's move on to market risk. the number of buyers competing for suppliers' goods and services, and as demand increases or becomes volatile, and as we have entrance to the market or exit to the market, the supply risk, the supply volume can fluctuate and therefore provide risks associated. Another market risk is this notion of shorter product life cycles that changes the mentality in terms of investment, and that suppliers do prefer to make, realizing that instead of a 10-year turnaround, they need to make their investment count and move on to the next thing in 3 years. And so that becomes another risk associated. So it's a lot easier for suppliers to pull out of an investment with or a contract with a manufacturer. Emerging technologies, as technologies change, that creates market risks, and risks of maintaining trade secrets and intellectual properties, be it with suppliers or be it with other competitors. In the end, it is possible for others to get a hold of what we have in terms of trade secrets and intellectual properties in the market. Let's also talk about sourcing risk. This goes back to supply chain strategies, and we're going to discuss these in more detail. Some of these in reverse can be a good strategy in terms of resilience and mitigation of issues, but the longer the supply pipelines, the more possibilities of things going wrong, and so that sourcing strategy can become quite risky, and the potential for supply disruptions are there. We're going to talk about supply risk in a couple of slides later. But nevertheless, as one sourcing strategy is of course a multiple sourcing, which is for the with the intention of increasing supplier competition in terms of quality, cost, delivery, whatever else. However, that also can mean that suppliers have to take their eyes off of the ball when it comes to their upstream suppliers and their internal operations when facing disruptions or in preparation for disruptions. And so that creates another sourcing risk. Another associated risk with sourcing, especially across continents and across time zone, is the ability to communicate, right? So both from a language perspective, from a time perspective, those become more difficult. And so those are some of the sourcing risk. Financial risk, frankly, as we have reduced the amount of buffer and financial buffers, and the inventory carrying cost and currency exchange fluctuations and soft and hard currencies, all of these could create issues for suppliers. As we speak right now, apparently many American manufacturers have a difficult time being competitive simply because the dollar is so strong, which means that they can't sell their product with the same margins as before overseas. And so for a firm like GE, which has almost 2/3, I believe, of their income and sales coming from outside the United States, the stronger dollar makes a huge difference in their bottom line. Let's talk about supplier risk. That's the focus essentially here. Financial stability of suppliers becomes more and more as we rely more and more on them. And so the ability to monitor, evaluate, select good suppliers that are healthy from a financial standpoint, can pay their bills, and otherwise can be important. And also being able to identify sources of information that can tell us about suppliers is critical. And so supplier evaluation and selection takes another role, a different role, and risk management and risk assessment becomes a critical aspect of how we evaluate and select suppliers. Again, their capabilities for now and for the future, right, becomes critical. It's not just about what they can do for us now, but down the line, let's say, if we increase our volume or if we give them another a component to produce and supply, can they manage that? And is their upstream family of suppliers also able to grow with them? So all of these factors can become a key aspect. So next, we're going to talk about supply chain disruptions, but I'm going to stop here and start the third third part of this lecture in another video clip. So